Hello everyone, today we talk about the Tudor army organization. We recently made a video just about Tudor infantry, and we looked in part also at this organic aspect as well. This is instead a general introduction on the forces that the Kingdom of England could muster at this point in its history, naturally intersected with the political and social background and sustainability of this army. At the same time, I'm glad that we have several videos about Tudor warfare already. We will continue, especially with the Armada series, but there is actually really a lot about 16th century England that, aside from the Navy, that we will not discuss today because we will have done in another video, of course, in many other videos, even more obviously, these same military activities on land in the same dear old England, so to say, were actually consistent, right? There were rebellions, there were, aside from the conflicts, of course, with Scotland, with Ireland, also in the continent, mostly against the French. There was some, as you know, level of political instability due to confessional clashes, to rebellions that at times were triggered also by, in fact, the monarchic needs for troops, as it would happen later on with the ship money, etc. We will also continue the series about the English Civil War at some point. Also about that, we made enough videos. So again, I'm really glad to be covering early modern English warfare. For some reason, I don't know why, but ever since I started talking about the Tudor army, mostly because it was always military history, I'd never gotten too many views, but it may also be because we don't have too many videos to attract attention on that. And there is this notion, in fact, that 16th century England was relatively peaceful, which is indeed true if you compare to other centuries, but it's not like there was no military activity. In fact, the English army in this century engaged in a substantial range of military activities that although on a relatively limited scale compared to the sprawling wars of continental powers, still included several campaigns, in fact, against the same France, persistent tensions, and two significant wars with Scotland. I also made something about the Scottish infantry of the same period, especially the lowland pikemen, as the most representative fighter at this point in those northern forces. We have extended troubles in Ireland that we will have also to cover in some depth. I have something for especially 17th century Irish warfare, but the 16th is also pretty fascinating. English assistance to both factions in the Netherlands at some point, not just supporting the rebels during the 80 Years' War, but at times, in fact, supporting the empire against France. Support for the Huguenots in France, we've seen it in the video about the French Wars of Religion, and of course defensive preparations against potential invasions that never occurred, that however also remain somehow more famous in the description of the English spirit in those circumstances and the eventual success, mostly however of course collected by the Royal Navy, that again I partly discussed in other videos that we'll continue to cover. So today we really talk the entire, if not maybe not really the medieval, the very beginning of Tudor period, but say Henry VIII, the Protector Somerset, Mary Tudor, and of course Elizabeth I, both at home and abroad. So we can look at the organization of English armies on campaigns. Henry VIII's invasions of France in 1513, so with the Battle of the Spurs, with 25,000 men organized into three wards, vanguard, main, and rear. We talked about it in the previous video about the infantry organization, under captains like Sir Edward Poynings. Each ward subdivided into companies of 200, 300, led by knights like Sir John Neville, with quartermasters managing supply trains of 500 wagons. In 1544, that is the Siege of Boulogne, mustering 30,000 men, including 6,000 militia from Kent and Sussex, coordinated by the Duke of Norfolk through a council of war with 12 regiments of 2,000 to 3,000 men each, supported by 2,000 German Landsknechte hired via agents in Antwerp. as you understand, it involved already, in this sense, not actually modest forces at all. Actually, for 16th century standards, and we were talking about it just the other day, looking at the Renaissance army size, they were pretty massive forces. Naturally, not all of them were involved in like a single engagement in the same time. However, they were, at least numerically speaking, competitive compared with their French opponents, also their imperial allies, for that matter. We see here, of course, the same German mercenaries offered by the emperors. We see English militia sent, were drafted abroad. So this is interesting, and I'm sure that at some point we will make even more in-depth videos about how the single forces were actually recruited and shipped across the channel, etc. As you understand, we can't do just so much at a time, but there is actually a lot about 16th century English warfare that I would really like to visit, because it's, I presume, a topic not so well covered compared to other times. Let's say the Wars of the Roses, the same rise of the Tudors, or just the later Civil War, and all, of course, the later English and British history. But again, the notion that the Tudor era was somehow peaceful, I think, would be interestingly reversed in at least pop culture. I know that you are aware of this as well. The king's spears and later the gentlemen pensioners were elite bodyguards of men at arms, riding fully armored barded horses in the typical guise of the Renaissance, right? Think about the French gendarme, right? There were a few other English men at arms fighting in the same way at the same time. You know that England at this point, at least along the first half of the 16th century, was a fairly updated country, right, military-wise. However, it had been severed from most continental military developments. So you could have billmen, longbowmen still, as we've seen in the video about the infantry organization, constituting really an impressive size of the overall force in a time in which the continent was going for pike and shot, and that, of course, gradually the English adopted as well, but not quite with that speed. In fact, you can argue that especially the second half of the 16th century witnessed an English backwardness, and things that would not really improve until Cromwell, really. And due to broader political international problems, mostly this can be traced back to the English defeat during the 100 Years' War. This is not valid for the Navy instead, right? And that is also kind of self-explanatory, and we know it well. But land forces were another thing. So it's interesting how, in case of need, powerful rulers like Henry VIII would have to put together, like, sometimes in a heterogeneous force. Consider that England relied importantly on the continent for guns, horses, armor. We've seen it in the video about infantry, notoriously, like the Flemish, the Germans, the Italians provided, even the Spaniards at some point, important amount of troops. I mean, think about the marriage of Philip II of Spain with Mary Tudor, right? So that was also a phase before, of course, the Armada during the Catholic temporary Catholic representation. In any case, attempts to supplement men-at-arms were still relevant for most European forces. The shock heavy cavalry was still a thing, even in the age of pike and shot warfare. In fact, the English recurred at some point to the Burgundians. This is interesting because as long as they were allied with the Imperials, we're not talking about the Burgundians of Burgundy that, as you know, had been taken over by France, but let's say the Burgundian inheritance of the Habsburgs. So we're talking mostly the Flemish that were, I mean, the same Habsburgs, if you look at Charles V's upbringing, could be considered in that context like Burgundian gentlemen of some sort by lifestyle, by culture. And Burgundy, and let's say the Netherlands in this sense, had actually inherited great part of that courtly luxury, splendor, etc. Now the states of Burgundy that we also made videos on were no more. We also talked about their armies. However, their chivalric, knightly, tournament culture had fairly survived. It was a different time, though, from the Golden Age. In fact, in 1544, many of these Burgundians arrived actually as an early type of mercenary reiter armed with pistol and boar spear, which was typical of, in fact, we are here basically by the mid-16th century, which was also the moment of greatest shrinking of properly heavy cavalry tactics. The reiter, as you know, was basically this skirmisher, right, equipped with highly qualitative technological wheel-lock pistols that mostly just the German clock workers were able, through their technology, to provide with at an important scale. It was a very expensive mechanism, and this can be considered sort of picked troops, but still as skirmishers, because, yes, they had the capacity eventually of charging, even throwing their own precious pistols in the head of the opponent before charging in. That's what cavalry always does, but in a moment in which, let's say, that gendarme figure was not really quite brilliantly there anymore. Burgundian lancers, however, were also present, so proper shock forces, with chargers, etc., that could have been supported, in fact, in part by these other more flexible units. The Scottish wars, notably Flodden, the Flodden campaign in 1513, were 14,000 English troops under the Earl of Surrey, organized in two battles, main and rear, with archers and billmen in mixed formations of 5,000 to 7,000, each led by bannerets like Sir Edward Stanley, crushed, in fact, famously enough in that battle, a larger Scottish force. Seeing all English cavalry fight on foot, except for a mounted reserve of 1,500 border staves. They were somehow lighter type of horsemen connected to that sort of frontier clashes typical of the Scottish, in fact, border clashes. This is interesting. We'll talk about the Battle of Flodden because it shows still how competitive troops like billmen and longbowmen were in this early 16th century. It's not like the Scots were particularly advanced compared to continental warfare. They really weren't compared to the English. So that's quite a thing. And again, if you're interested a bit more in the Scottish infantry of the period, I made a video about them. We'll come back on all these topics on Schwerpunkt. Ideally, nothing can be exhausted, right? In any case, Flodden was likely the last time English forces fought dismounted in their traditional style, or at least the one that we most typically recall, like from the 100 Years' War, the armies of Edward III onwards. I will not explain here in the broader art of war why this was happening in general. Let's say that these medieval styles had happened for a reason. Last month I made an entire series explaining why the English had started to fight, by the way, so successfully the way they did during the 100 Years' War, regardless of the ultimate outcome of the war. But we can argue that, first of all, like, since the later Middle Ages, telling the truth, and we highlighted a bit the same point, that these armies were actually much more similar to one another than we think. And again, there were specific contingent reasons. If the English had been fighting dismounted, first of all, just by the fact that we say dismounted, we are literally stating that these guys were conceived to primarily fight on horseback, right? But indeed, in the Renaissance, there is a further blending of a sort of a especially Western European, but not only, art of war, military culture, and although the English, as we just said, lagged a bit behind, generally speaking, the only way to go at war, especially towards the later 16th century, was to follow the organizational patterns of fundamentally pike and shot warfare. Javelins, staves, prickers, and border horse, names for the standard English light cavalry armed primarily with a light spear, sometimes supplemented with a crossbow or firearm, remained in use, as expert scouts and looters, especially on the Scottish border, but not always valuable on the battlefield. They were really light cavalry compared to the more sort of mainstream one. Though they saved one flank at Flodden and destroyed a Scots army at Solway Moss later on as well. So there are instances where, of course, these troops are useful. It's not like the Scots have even better. I mean, the English here actually have the best cavalry of the British archipelago. But it's this tendency a bit like of the same Scots to fight prevalently with infantry, the Irish that are also highly exploitative of terrain and hopefully not having to face the English in open field, would maintain at least this lighter cavalry as useful, because as the only type of cavalry around, or at least the most common one next to this gradually fading men-at-arms, at least probably in the heavier medieval style and sense. Naturally, at the in the British armories we find splendid Tudor era, very heavy armor, Italian, German, etc. This was for the very ultra elite. Otherwise, they cost really a lot, and so even just fielding extensive amounts of these troops was very, very difficult. Right, mostly just bigger countries like France, etc., could, especially of such aristocratic character in that case, had really large amounts of such cuirassiers, right? And that's why, as we said, the Tudor monarchs even get some Burgundians, hopefully from that kind of French inherited background, right? But that's also normal, and especially again towards the mid 16th century, cavalry has reached sort of the lowest point before gradual coming back all over, especially Western Europe, because of pike and shot tactics. The rough wooing, 1543-1550, under Protector Somerset, aimed at forcing a dynastic marriage, so militia-based armies, often under 10,000 men, something similar to the Wars of the Roses, let's say, struggle with harsh terrain and logistics, with campaigns like Pinkie, 1547, Pinkie Clough, 1547, involving 16,000 men under the Duke of Somerset, organized into 3 divisions with 1,500 cavalry and troops of 50 to 100. These were basically the old companies led by captains like Lord Grey of Wilton, supported by 200 pioneers for entrenchments as well. This is, again, something that British warfare somehow maintains from this past for different reasons. There is less cavalry around. Infantry digs in more frequently. Again, it's a style of combat. It's not like conventionally these troops could not do something different. But for that particular context, it was pretty fitting. Gunnery from English ships offshore was critical at Pinkie, 1547. I made a video also about the Battle of Gravelines, where you see the Royal Navy in action, at least their support. That's the first case of a naval bombardment, right? Probably of an enemy army, right, along the shore. So it's an interestingly experimental phase. However, mostly the most indicated way, let's say, in case you needed firepower, was to of course to land, to unload the actual guns and to serve properly like land armies. Gravelines, by the way, is in 1558 under Mary Tudor, at the time married, as we were saying, to Philip II of Spain. That also witnessed, in fact, there the interaction between the Imperials and the English, and in fact also entailed expected Spanish aid to England when needed in that specific circumstance. In Ireland, campaigns like the Desmond Rebellions, 1569 to 1583, relied on small mobile forces, as we were saying before, also from the English side for that particular theater, from 2,000 to 4,000. They were enough to go, chase the Irish in their nests. These forces were frequently drawn from local militias, by the way. So, as you know, the English of Ireland, quite influenced by Celtic identity and customs, but reinforced at points by saying Gaelic allies or other pressed men in general. Right, that was also the practice. We talked about that for 18th century warfare, but it was already a thing from centuries. These troops could be organized into companies of 100, 200, because we're mostly talking infantry, under captains like Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who integrated 300 Cairn. You know them, who never made a historical military unit episode for them, but these were essentially light infantrymen of this Celtic sort of hit-and-run guerrilla type, with 400 English pikemen in 4 bands. So this is interesting because we're not just talking, say, local English settlers, but sometimes properly English troops from Britain combined with this lighter troop. So pikemen and skirmishers, as opposed to the shot. Besides, the English were, of course, served by local seneschals as far as supplies logistics were concerned. Elizabethan support for the Dutch revolt after 1585 involved instead 6,000 to 8,000 troops under commanders like the Earl of Leicester, divided into garrisons of 500 to 1,000 across Dutch towns like Flushing, each with a governor like Sir Robert Sidney managing 10 companies, while aid to Huguenots in France, such as during the 1591 Rouen expedition, was limited to 3,000 to 4,000 men, often poorly supplied, organized in ad hoc bands of 200-300 under Sir John Norris, with temporary lieutenants coordinating supply from Rouen merchants. A great part of the reason is that the English were, generally speaking, more invested in the support of the Dutch for a broader array of political, confessional, and strategic reasons. The French could easily mess up things on their own as the giant that they were in that later 16th century, after having lost the Italian wars and now having to cope, in fact, with confessional struggles. But again, fewer troops mostly in Gascony were enough. And it's not like the English had all the money in the world, by the way. They were just more pressed to help the Dutch, also to divert, by the way, the Armada at some point, or other attempts to disintegrate their kingdom at a time. It's interesting, as you see here, that the infiltration in France continues, like alongside the patterns of medieval warfare, mostly in Normandy and Gascony, for similar reasons. Even though Normandy was much more loyal at this point to the French, to the monarchic cause in general. English armies also intervened in Scotland on behalf of Scottish Protestants against the French party in 1560 and 1570. This has to do with various dynastic vicissitudes of the Crown of Scotland. And in France on behalf of Huguenots against Catholics and Spanish in 1562, 63, and 1591, 97. Of course, this was all aimed at supporting the Protestant cause and avoid to have, like, literally, I don't know, Scotland completely turn against England at some point, and in fact, France capable of keeping to fuel that hostility that naturally was already pretty present, generally speaking, by tradition, so to say. Rebellions in Ireland, 1566, 67, 1569, 81, and 1595, 1601, the last aided by a substantial, though belated, Spanish force, necessitated the largest English expedition sent overseas during Elizabeth's reign, initially under the Earl of Essex, and later under her best general, Mountjoy. Defensive preparations, especially during the 1588 Spanish Armada crisis, saw musters of up to 100,000 men across southern counties, which doesn't mean, of course, that these troops could be literally mobilized or, mustered in a single place. Like it mostly was, as you understand here, for the purpose of defending the wall of England. Of course, in certain cases, maybe being shipped, to Ireland, having to serve, in other theaters, wherever this would have been required. Most of the Spanish wanted to land in Scotland. In any case, you have county lieutenants like Sir Francis Walsingham in Hampshire organizing, for example, 9,000 foot and 600 horse into 6 divisions of 1,500 to 2,000, each under a colonel like Sir George Carey, with beacons and messengers ensuring rapid mobilization. Though most remained on standby, as of course no invasion materialized, but even if that had happened, it's unlikely that the English would have again managed to put together such a cohesive force, especially militia, against the best of European professionals with the Spanish tercios and more. So that's one of the greatest, most famous scenarios in early modern warfare. Mostly we have to study that from a naval standpoint. Henry VIII frequently allied with the Holy Roman Empire and hosting Maximilian I on campaign, famously enough, relied on mercenaries, as we've seen, rather than a cooperating allied army, though he often expected one as well. When we look at these forces, we can look at their organization through the type of weaponry that they held. We already hinted at something, and we've often seen this in early modern English warfare. The English army definitely stands out in Europe for 2 key reasons. Firstly, its weaponry was unique, and again, not necessarily for the better, as England continued to use the bill, cavalry ranks, and most prominently the longbow, long after these had been discarded elsewhere in favor of firearms and pikes. I made a video about the use of longbows, crossbows even, and composite bows in Europe from, say, 1500 to the mid-17th century, which mostly is, as you understand, a sort of Eastern European Balkan history of sort. But England, at least for the longbow, also stands out in that regard. Again, the reason why England can't put together like pike and shot formations on a regular basis is that they have enough troops they can't recruit in the way we have seen. In some ways, they are enough, even just by size, to cope with the relative strategic challenges, especially in the British archipelago, because the Celtic French is less developed. And they, especially, they don't have really much money. We've seen it really with the actual numbers of troops, mostly infantrymen at this point in Renaissance warfare, and even more, as we've seen in Britain, by the monarchy, say even under Henry VIII, mostly used as garrison forces, by the way. So it's mostly really a matter of money. It's not like Europe is suddenly booming economically without further problems. There are lots of ups and downs. And again, England is a bit isolated and not particularly resourceful on its own. This explains largely why they preferred, especially even though they had, again, threats within the same Britain, to, however, adapt to sort of a lower profile, considering very pragmatically what the direct challenges really were, investing, for example, more in the Navy. We talked recently a bit about the longbow with a draw weight of 100 to 180 pounds and a range of 250 to 300 yards. That probably, again, was employed in battle and without stretching that far its performance, but rather investing on the collective effect. In any case, especially even against continental forces, up to the mid-16th century, this weapon remained formidable and, of course, lethal. as evidenced by its devastating effect, by the way, at Flodden. It's a British context, not a continental one, but still similar, where archers deployed in wings of 3,000. So basically the same medieval formation under the command of local knights like Sir Thomas Howard, mowed down badly armored Highlanders that were generally speaking poorer and were fighting in ways that basically were identical to to the one of the High Middle Ages. Though, in fact, it was less effective against the Scots nobles providing lowland pikemen with a front rank, quote, so surely armored that shot of arrows did them no harm. Right? We've seen it, again, in that aforementioned video about the lowland pikemen. They were better organized, historically had been more influenced by continental developments via England, notoriously enough. We will at some point talk about Highlander warfare during this early period as well. As you know, they fought a lot abroad, also during the 30 Years' War, etc. The bill. This was... I made a video about pole arms in general. This was a hooked pole weapon derived from agricultural tools. Again, it was a very developed weapon by medieval standards. There were even more advanced forms. For example, the Italian bill had 4 distinct functions, etc. In this sense, they were fairly complex to use, right? It's wrong to presume that, a pike was used in more sophisticated ways than a bill, but the pike is a weapon serving at that point a much larger unit that is collectively trained on a specific purpose of presenting with that mass. And as we've seen, however, there's not a big deal of pike and shot warfare in Britain or Ireland, even less among the Celts. So the bill man is still actual in all this, and it wielded pole arms do not really disappear, as you know, even until the 18th century in some cases. But in this English circumstance, it was atypically wielded by up to 20-30% of militia infantry per 1577 Somerset musters, by the way, that are fairly well documented due to, obviously, its affordability and versatility in close combat, mostly from that sort of individual perspective rather than in a bigger collective purpose, proving in any case more than a match for Scots pikes, even at Flodden, where, quote, they shortly disappointed the Scots of their long spears wherein was their greatest trust. They could not resist the bills that lighted so thick and sore upon them, which is, we will see the Battle of Flodden. It's very interesting, but again, you can have even pikeman formations collapsing for other reasons. Also combined armed tactics, leadership, morale, etc. So we're not saying that, of course, the bills were so actual. And in fact, we don't see a great deal of that in continental Europe for a reason. Efforts to adopt pike and arquebus did happen, of course, because the English wanted to update their forces to continental standards. Such troops were supplemented, however, usually by foreign specialists that ended up being more cost-benefits effective. It's a bit like what the French do by hiring the Swiss, mostly. Also, the English fear rebellions of large veterans that know how, again, to wield a pike collectively. And so you can send mostly these Germans, the Landsknechten, at some point probably sent by the emperors, back home. These are professionals. I made a video about the Landsknechten. Many of you are, have subscribed to Schwerpunkt through those videos. We will keep talking about them as well. There were also Landsknecht arquebusiers, for that matter, requiring to stay within one move, however, of their own connational pikemen to, of course, increase the performance of combined armed tactics. I mean, you spend for the Landsknecht, you want them to full use. Again, it's not they are a crack force, but they aren't too many either. So when you look at what was happening, especially in Britain, sometimes you find them there, but they're not technically probably the backbone of the entire army. All forces considered. The 1511 Act for the Maintenance of Archery mandated weekly practice ensuring a pool of skilled bowmen, though by the 1590s, master roles show increasing numbers of arquebusiers. From 30 to 40 of infantry weapons in Kent by 1596, with county captains training shot in volleys of 20, 30 per at least these 1590 drill records. This is very important because literally, you know that since the Middle Ages, the later Middle Ages, the English kings had specifically mandated during local festivals, etc., these displays, these competitions, ensuring that many young men would be able to handle the bow as they could be recruited. Also as an anti-nobiliar measure of some sort, you know, that the longbow had become sort of a symbol, at least of the gentry in general, and a myth was also built a bit upon them. You couldn't really challenge the nobility just with these guys, but it was a counterbalancing factor for the monarchy, politically wise as well. In the same way, gradually guns enter the same process, the same path. So you literally pass from training with the bow with a firearm. English infantry at the start of Elizabeth's reign were roughly a quarter each of billmen, pikemen, longbowmen, and cavalrymen, which is really not the best picture, meaning that the more different they are, the least effective. At least you would have liked to tendentially uniform things, at least towards greater pike prevalence, as it happened in Continental armies, where you still had halberdiers, guys with pole arms, etc., and some kind of more updated and uniform type of shot. By that time, essentially, the musket was already around, was gradually substituting the arquebus, etc. So there were different types actually in between. We don't even understand from the sources exactly what is a musket, what was an arquebus, at least in that specific instance, because the terms could also be confused in a Prelinian language. In any case, bills were fairly quickly replaced by a small number of halberdiers also in England. This happened as a color guard and extra pikes, with longbows more slowly replaced by, quote, fiery shot. When trained billmen were rearmed with pikes, their bills were sometimes given to untrained men, right? So they passed basically to the expandables in the most emergential situations. Basically, that's when they started fading out of use in practice. Regular forces had no bows after 1588. We know that there were, societies going at war with the longbow with serious intentions, like also during the English Civil War. I mean, even on the beaches of Normandy, you could find, famously enough, British officers going at war literally with a longbow. However, at least after the Armada campaign, most of the English had been boosting their own updates with great cost, with great effort, and again, actually a very poor army at that point, all considered, especially compared to the Spanish. However, still at that point, technologically gapping with what had been the main issues with these older types of arms. Some county militia did use bows until bowmen at least were recorded as unarmed in 1595. This is also a historical time, because since Romano-Germanic times, at least the lowest type of actually armed man was a bowman, was mostly like a serf, etc. But by this point, they are basically crossed out, right? These longbowmen actually remained a favorite on the turbulent Scottish border, because the bow was simply handier, and just, let's be honest, like the local communities were poorer. In fact, you see even bills surviving as the minimum acceptable home defense weapon there, because broader pike the pike is good in that collective fashion. If you don't have many men just trained to collectively use that in larger formation, like at that point, it's better even to go at war with a bill. And it's not like, unless, I don't know, the Scottish army rolled into England in large forces, most of the clashes were fairly small, you know. Now, the cavalry ranks used by demi-lancers, that is light cavalry, essentially wealthier, or lighter cavalry, say better, wealthier militiamen riding unbarded horses, persisted in small numbers, perhaps, I don't know, let's say 5 to 10% of forces organized in troops of 20, 50 under gentlemen like Sir Philip Sidney, each with a cornet, that is, a standard bearer, for unit cohesion, reflecting England's limited mounted tradition compared to, say, the French gendarmerie, for example. Demi-lances in three-quarter armor were the standard heavy cavalry by Elizabeth's reign, with the fully armored men-at-arms of the gentlemen pensioners making their last appearance in the 1560 Scottish expedition, though tilting in full armor remained a popular court sport. As you know, there is probably a line of tournament armor that increasingly detaches properly from battlefield use, so that's a bit of another story. In any case, lighter horsemen that are technically, at least some of them are even light cavalry proper, but they're mostly like intended as shock force in their respective theaters. Variously called light staves, spears, javelins, prickers, or border horses we've seen before greatly outnumber heavy cavalry and were armed primarily with light spears, sometimes supplemented with crossbows or firearms for peppering the enemy ranks before charging, etc. And it is something relatively similar actually to what we observed before of the Reiter, except they had also less firearms and they were less trained, like in the full, for example, caracol, orderly, formation, tactics, etc., that we will see better in another video. The first English specialist firearm cavalry appeared also fairly late in time compared, in fact, to Continental developments that had already that robust Reiter type, at least as a model, by the mid-16th century. These were essentially skirmishing petronels armed with a large caliber arquebus. We are in 1586. The Dutch also had rearmed English and Scots volunteers as pistoliers from 1577. Those pistoliers were, I think, we discussed this partly in when talking about Dutch warfare, which I hope we're going to come back on quite soon. The recruitment system and the militia is also key to understand the organization of Tudor armies, their strength and composition. The army, as we've seen, depended extensively on a national militia system in an era dominated by mercenary armies abroad, such as the aforementioned German Landsknechte or Swiss pikemen, who formed disciplined regiments of 3,000 to 5,000 under professional colonels, unlike England's county-based levies led by local gentry and organized into bands, as we've seen, of 100, 300 under captains like Sir William Drury. Just throwing the names, and if you're interested in the commander, sort of the key officers of the period. It's also interesting to think that, I don't know, a German Landsknecht would have, for example, had an experience abroad, say during the Italian wars, fighting against the Swiss, and etc., having toured Europe, including England, where they could have also just communicated their experiences, would have contributed to offer further insight to this, but think about their officers, etc., to the same English forces, the English leaders, and more. All right, so it's not like, I don't know, these guys spawned there and just were silent dummies used just for the sake of war. There were actually quite, as we've seen, qualitative forces also because of the experience, just the information it could provide to the English. Since the Assize of Arms in 1181, Englishmen were obligated to possess arms based on their wealth. We were hinting at it before. In some instances, even their wives' clothing, a silk petticoat, could require one to supply the gear for a light horseman, including a padded jack, a solid helmet, and lance, as specified in 1542 Master Regulations, really a typical equipment for this kind of context, which, by the way, assign equipment by income tiers of this kind. More than 40 pounds for horsemen with brigandines and lances, from 5 to 40 pounds for pikemen or archers with jacks and helmets, Westbrook helmets per exchequer rolls. This framework, with some adjustments, continued well into the 16th century, reinforced by statutes like the 1558 Militia Act, which clarified obligations for men aged from 16 to 60, organized into parish masters under constables who reported to county commissioners, with roles like those of 1569 Gloucestershire, listing 4,000 men in 40 parishes, which meant, of course, that these troops, as we've seen, were eligible for like master and military service. In theory, also within certain geographical ranges from their homes. That, however, were actually rarely summoned. Also considering, first of all, not much the fact that they were scarce in quality, but also that this was really the basis, as we've seen, of the historical Anglo-Saxon levy, like you could find again in any other European country, that the English may have, as we've seen, relied a bit more, especially numerically wise, as lacking essentially professional forces that cost too much. By the way, historically, this form of recruitment, and again, I made videos about even the Anglo-Saxon, probably early medieval army organization composition. We're looking at the same thing. Had historically, as you know, from other countries, worked mostly on a rota basis, right? It means that one guy went actually to the army, but others would remain. Multiple ones would remain home, supplying him, right? Because again, in theory, like even as we've seen before, and we'll see even now, like 100,000 troops available in 1588, or 120,000 for the defense of Boulogne, were just all theoretical. Or you don't have to think that the work could be entirely expandable. At that point, the English could have mobilized 100,000. Maybe it was completely out of reach of any kind. Nobody would have even properly done it, right? With the money that would have been lost in the process, you could simply buy, as we've seen, just even a few thousand elite professionals would have had some greater strategic relevance, especially at a provincial level, right? So we're really looking at something else. However, again, the English seem to rely a bit more on these guys. We've seen even billmen, longbowmen. Wealthier yeomen, however, provided harness for pikemen or shot, right? So this militia could provide with some more updated means, as we've seen before, not probably in the numbers to, in fact, provide, as we haven't seen it really, and effectively update national English pike and shot army, right? But you had these yeomen, this more affluent landowners, while knights and gentry supplied horses and plate armor for cavalry, as they were better off even more. So this was, as we've seen, depending on the basis of your wealth, right, proportionally. This is seen, for example, in the 1584 Leicestershire Masters, listing 12 demi-lancers equipped by local elites like Sir George Hastings, each leading a troop of 10 to 15 with a designated trumpeter for signals. These were, again, 16 to 16 theory, all able-bodied freemen, right, provided with a certain amount of wealth. As we've seen at the end of the period, the longbowman is considered properly unarmed and so unfit for combat. So basically, we're too poor to be at least going at war with their own means, which was also a bit like the other notion in the story, like the crown and the nobility, as we've seen here, provided with the more centralized means to equip, to supply an army. This was completely normal. Like militia itself really was fairly scarce, but you could still join as a volunteer, and there were avenues, as we've seen, of privateering, mercenarism, etc. Now, sticking to the militia, all eligible men here assembled for inspections at varying intervals, up to twice annually during heightened risks, such as in 1539 or 1588, when counties like Cornwall held musters of 5,000 men under Sir Richard Grenville, this telling you how, again, sizable these forces could be. And again, as, for example, garrisons, defense troops, mostly protecting their own homes, right? It had always been a thing since the boroughs of Alfred the Great and even before. This master of the Cornish master was organized during the Armada campaign into 5 regiments with appointed ensigns and drummers. This, of course, was the darkest hour, so you would find lots of people willing to go properly to war, at least to defend, as we've seen, their own positions. This 5 regiments, so 1,000 men each, were managed by commissioners of masters that were a bit sort of more reliable figures, also from a strictly military point of view, that they had experience, or by 1557, in other cases, like Lord Lieutenants in 26 counties in England, like, for example, Sir William Paget's in Staffordshire, overseeing 3,000 men in 10 companies. So we see 300 men. Again, companies could vary. As you know, since the Middle Ages was this basic unit of, like, what an officer, that even way before that in history, like what an officer can command, commanding directly from the field, knowing each man ideally, right? Because there are normally like 100, 150 men you can't properly know by heart, knowing how they test in combat, and so using different units in that direct fashion. Naturally, and we dealt with this topic in other videos, the reason why sometimes these numbers are higher is that they were expected to drastically drop on campaign, right? And let's say, especially for militia, that can't even properly form in particularly effective pike and shot larger formations, and that mostly rely again on their own homes, even at some point from a logistical point of view, at least on base of the Shire, and that therefore may even simply at some point go back home, a bit like the Minutemen during the War of American Independence. In fact, has also some kind of Anglo-Saxon root, of course, to it. Maybe not strictly in this sense, but this could have happened to anyone, to any militia, but for making you understand what we're, say, the proximity to even this guy's private affairs, would have not really been particularly effective, right? And so if you could have, again, out of these 300 men at all times, effectively fit, an effectively fit third of that, right, was really a big deal. And that's what you could rely had, for example, like a field army of yours, properly with professionals, with noblemen, etc., was, say, passing by, say, the Spanish land, and you have to intervene. These guys can stiffen their numbers by this, again, small but compact and especially locally motivated, for local defense especially, troops that will support this force. This was, after all, normal. The normal composition of early modern armies was professionals, feudal levies, and militias. And again, what we see here is just that the English relied a bit too much on the latter, because the quality top of the former was really not available in as great numbers. And probably at large, England did not necessarily even need that most times, which is, again, not a good thing, because yes, it's a good thing that you are isolated, and that it's a big deal to hope even to invade England, but at large, even when such a crisis like in 1588 happened, you may not have properly the system, the structure, the institutions to field quickly effective troops in time. The clergy, lords, and their retainers had comparable duties to the ones of, in fact, militia troops proper, with bishops like John Scory in Hereford. This is an example, again, from the Armada, here furnishing 10 armed men as a single company, with a lieutenant and clerk for payrolls. Naturally, these were powerful people, prelates, landowners. In this way, by 1599, so just 2 years before the death of Elizabeth and the rise of the Stuarts in England, muster rolls suggest something 180 to 200,000 men as, let's say, nominally available. Again, if you made the same computation for other countries, you would, in that sense, have even more. It's likely that the English had, as we've seen, having more reliance, being more reliant on the militia would also document these instances more, and so these numbers are perhaps more pronounced for, again, not an immense country, as a matter of fact, even in terms of sheer population. But again, it would have been unrealistic to field more than a tenth of this. And just with militia, you just really go nowhere. So again, if these are poorly armed volunteers from all across the country that have to oppose themselves to an invasion force and an occupation force of, again, professional troops from the tercios, etc., like, they can, in all their mass, do something, but that's not how wars are actually fought. Eventually, there is a fairly widespread consensus regarding the fact that had the Spanish landed in 1588, England was done for, right? And for many reasons that now we're not simply going to digress on, we'll see it better in the Armada series, all right? It's remarkable, however, how this militia system was sort of deeply ingrained in Anglo-Saxon culture and military practice up to this point. So you have to understand how this mentally informed the English people throughout the centuries. You have, for example, better documented instances like individually accounted like Devon mustering 6,000 foot and 300 horse in regiments of 800, 1,200 under colonels like Sir Ferdinando Gorges, each with a sergeant major for drill coordination. Again, nothing clamorous, but still, right, for a single county, this is not bad at all. Soldiers typically return home after inspections unless mobilized. Soldiers, militiamen. This is the case there was eventually, like, if they had participated in broader campaigns, some sort of compensation, again, they would have been treated as draftees, as salaried troops in any case. But again, this was unfeasible for most of them organically wise. In any case, in 1544, we find such, in fact, predictable, again, they show up for the master and then they are basically sent back home, when Henry VIII maintained nominally 120,000 men to ideally intervene properly across the channel for Boulogne's defense, with Sussex raising 8,000 men in divisions of 1,000 to 2,000 under deputy lieutenants like Sir John Gage with 200 carts of provisions. Naturally, from Sussex, it was more plausible that these forces would have intervened to defend, protect Boulogne. By the way, of course, the greater part of English wealth today, as at the time heavily concentrated in the southeast of the country, that was also just much better connected, was better supported also by the fleet. It was hosting, of course, the centers of power and so on. Which was also interesting because, again, there wasn't like, I don't know, in France, a risk of disarticulation of England. England, if you look at the administrative map still today, it has much, so it doesn't have provinces like other countries like France or Germany. It mostly relies on the same counties that are thickly compact and altogether depend fundamentally from the center, even in their autonomy. And at the time, it was something fairly similar, with, of course, actually much lesser grip on the overall country. It's not like, again, rebellions wouldn't happen during this period. They were quite serious. It could engulf the entire country. Pretty nasty business. However, there were some advantages of being a fairly sort of middle-sized, compact country, mostly surrounded by water and just with underdeveloped neighbors in the north, right? So mostly England had to fear from more advanced giants like, again, France, Spain. Now, and for this task, militia was ideally good, even though, again, would have not stood much of a chance in open field, especially against regular armies, if we can so call them, in this period. From 1573, also the trained bands, one of the first topics ever covered on Schwerpunkt, of 10 to 20% of county levies, like 1,200 men from Norfolk, 6,000 in 1584, formed companies of 100 under captains like Sir Thomas Knivet, trained monthly with county funds. Essex spent, for example, £1,200 annually on powder by 1590. Powder was incredibly expensive, like the arquebus, the projectile, the ammo, like it wasn't much of a thing. But the powder cost a lot. These troops were using Dutch-style tactics from treatises like Stratioticus 1579, actually voiced my, so to say, enormous skepticism regarding the effectiveness, let's say the applicability of military treatises, especially probably in an art of war sense, other than, again, teaching guys like how to deploy geometry, which is something that mostly actually even medieval infantrymen could really do. The entire Protestant codes, especially starting from the Netherlands, began to emanate this notions that they had sorted out some broader tactical development to tackle the Spaniards or all this stuff. Absolutely nothing like that. First of all, they were steamrolled by the Catholics in northern Germany during the 30 Years' War, so in even more advanced times. So the entire Nassau School was mostly like a propaganda hub. We know actually the Spanish had tackled sort of more advanced tactical problems already. They had bigger armies. They also used the same kind of fluidification of tactics, greater emphasis on firepower, etc., in a much bigger level than these guys ever could, right? So it's also the Dutch didn't really face the Spanish in open field. They were very successful in siege warfare, and they were incredibly determined, etc. But again, like, let's be honest, like the Protestant world at this time in history is actually the underdeveloped part of Europe. And this is deeply felt also at the military level. Made plenty of videos on this, so if you're interested, you can check that out in the Renaissance Warfare playlist. Firearms were, of course, increasing in importance, but English calibers were somehow rudimentary. They required a 20-step loading process, so half to a full minute, according at least ideally to 1587 manuals. Then in combat it was a completely different story, because you have to, in theory, coordinate the volleys, and instead, after the first one, first of all, you couldn't see anything. That problem wouldn't be resolved, if not chemically speaking, getting rid of most of the smoke in the second half of the 19th century. But in general, everything was heavily messed up. Pike formations were still by far the most important element. And they demanded, in fact, a formation discipline in squares of 200, 300 per, say, as individual companies that eventually had to make up the regiment, right? per 1588 manuals. If you're interested in this stuff, again, I made lots of videos about Renaissance armies organization and like the entire problem of, let's say, the chronic understrength of the period, etc. So we're just seeing this now from the English side of the story. Longbowmen achieved 10-12 shots per minute, ideally, at least trained informally at village butts per 1543 statute. In any case, as you've seen, those weren't going to be competitive on the long run. For overseas campaigns, troops were often pressed from militias or trained bands, including vagrants and offenders, as in 1585 Dorset's 200 rogues for the Netherlands, which is also, quite an advantage. Like if you're England, historically, you can actually wage war on other people's lands, mostly, especially across the sea. That's sort of easier. And you can't even press gang these guys, sending them to die somewhere for your own interest, which seems actually a pretty intelligent and positive thing to do. If it wasn't for the fact that sort of properly trained, armed, motivated professional soldiers would always be best. But again, if you have just to throw meat into the grinder, like you can use this as well. Besides, this could even become, in some other cases, good soldiers at some point, and enlist individually in some more sophisticated units. This forces like militias or trained bands were organized in companies like the others. I've just seen, 150, like, for example, under Roger Williams. Elizabethan expeditions like the 1589 Portugal campaign, 7,000 men in 10 regiments under Sir Francis Drake, or 1591 in Normandy, 3,400 men under Sir John Norris, faced, of course, important logistical challenges, to say the least. They were extremely bold enterprises. They had roughly 1/5 the sergeant rates, and which was not even that high objectively, but mostly supply shortages. So even though there was a bulk of motivated professionals there, of course, leading the way, this was also what England could, at times, also with great expenses, carry out to wear out the enemy and show. However, there was also an important moral dimension to this, that the English could project their forces that far in case of need as well. By the 17th century, the militia's limitations, that is, low funding, £2,000 annually per county, inconsistent training, and defective weapons, apparently up to 1/3 in 1596 Kent musters, were evident, with the new model army's 22,000 professional soldiers in 1645 fully exposing its obsolescence. Paradoxically, as I always say, emerging from, we don't want to pay taxes for the army, to eventually, recruiting an even more powerful army than anything that Charles I had intended to establish with his ship money. So militia, of course, was surpassed at that point. We said it at the beginning. It would persist in local defense roles, so it's not like the militias completely disappear, especially in common law countries. As you know, there is an important ethos, again, revolving around even the same right of bearing army. Of course, everything is also very much controlled at some point historically. But it gives you an idea of how difficult it is to put forces together. This would be much better understood also from an economical standpoint. I mean, how much money did the English crown make, and what kind of political issues they had, even in controlling important rebellions that at some point jeopardized the stability of the same monarchy for a consistent amount of time. Thus, it's mostly something we will have to expand on while looking at proper English history. Again, I want to start, I don't know when this is going to happen, but at some point we will have to talk about early modern history proper, not just warfare, because this is mostly what we have done. So we can glue that together and having some much more straightforward reference to the evenemential history of it all. We can definitely see this in more practical terms and drawing the actual connections, right? There is so much about this. It's not just about mentioning these numbers, etc. These can give you an idea of how things work at large and how difficult it is to make an army work. And also a bit, I'm writing about this. I will probably be publishing something. I can't tell you, that you will probably see. I've been asked by an Italian military history journal to publish, which I will do in English, because technically I could even write in Italian or the other languages that I know. But I think, especially for Schwerpunkt, this could, because it's an open source thing. It's actually a serious journal. They're getting to the top tier band, but for this reason they're publishing like crazy. And the director asked me, like, why don't you write something about this? And what I point out, because it's for an early modern warfare section of this journal. So I'm a medievalist. I don't know if they know it, but they said, okay, well, why don't you, we have a slot here, why don't you? It's not an article technically, because they say they can't sponsor, because they have public funds and they can't sponsor my private endeavor, essentially. So it's not going to be an article. In fact, I haven't asked to participate to their, because there are articles there as well. I'm publishing elsewhere under, and not as Schwerpunkt, of course. But this is specifically to publicize the channel, see what that brings. And so I will write this, I don't know, it's like 4,000 words. And I was writing exactly for early modern warfare, what I was talking about now, telling you regarding the heavy continuity existing properly in the methods of recruitment and in the army organizations from medieval times. Right, we have this notion, oh my God, armies now are so, in the Renaissance, really, like, I mean, if you really have in England to wait, aside from these militias in Henry VIII's times, to have an army of 20,000 men, well, congratulations. It's a bit terrifying to imagine. Of course, like, there is a more professional outlook at some point, a greater homogeneity in the equipment, etc. But it's also like a pretty, there were armies of 30,000 in the Middle Ages without actually also the drama that especially certain channels want to make regarding the alleged small size of medieval armies, as a matter of fact. And again, we will surely talk about these topics on other occasions. Because also about Tudor warfare, there is technically a lot, right? Battles, we haven't been covering them much, but they're interesting, there's plenty of. And in general, there is always something to connect also with other countries and so on. So it's really easy to go by that. Besides, I'm glad, as I was saying in the beginning, that we're talking more about Tudor warfare, because it seemed like... it seems like, as always, like the more you learn about something, the more it seems interesting. There is no doubt about this, and I made in last year's videos about Tudor warfare. I knew relatively few about them myself before I started Schwerpunkt, but step by step, also through other sources, we're going to look at them. Just please also watch these videos, because or share, whatever, as always, I say it just every time in the end, but I've been having some extremely strange drop in views that doesn't have to, it started from probably the homepage views, not my homepage, but your own pages, which means that probably you're behaving the same identical way as before. You like my videos and you want to watch them, but YouTube is not showing it to you for some reason. It's been going down. I've been making, as you know, the same type of videos. They have made also in the last several months, like actually pretty very high and unprecedentedly high views. It's very solid stuff. But for some reason, YouTube has been giving me this pain now, which I honestly don't know how even to properly address, because if it is just a matter of why does this happen, right? It's not so clear at all, and I especially don't seem to have many means to contrast that other than you sharing it on other channels, on all possible platforms that you have, because literally this is not just about suggesting something to someone. This should be about, at this time, Schwerpunkt should have at least, I don't know, way more subscribers, but also probably much higher traffic. And especially subscribers rising. And this does not happen, even though I have a high engagement rate. And I must say that when you have 27,000 subscribers and in a day you get barely 400 views at the video that you make, it starts making you wonder, like, how much, even just if all the people, say 1/10 of the persons who watched shared somewhere, probably would have a much higher growth and it would be all incredibly easier, right? Instead, we are confined to this. We have this initial views and then nobody watches. Like in the first hour, maybe 100, not 100 even, like it never even gets to that. It's very weird. Again, in past months, it was structurally and systemically much higher than that. Now it's just, frankly, it's very worrying, right? And I see that it keeps going down. So it's definitely something systemic connected with the way YouTube basically promotes other content and lets mine die. And you are, however, aware that I exist. So at that point, there's no excuse behind this. So of course, if you don't want me to make videos anymore, you can tell me. But this is also something that I think is being crammed on you by YouTube venial interest, producing ever shorter, condensated content that I don't think really helps anyone educationally speaking, and that we could, I think, bypass a little bit dealing with sort of more important things, especially for some greater benefit. Because again, the fact that this stuff is not even properly fished from the engine is a bit bad, considering that I'm also the only person dealing with specific topics. And it's not like this is niche. I mean, if you go out there seeing what kind of titles there is all kind of stuff that may seem as niche, and they make way more views, even with, again, AI, without any kind of effort. So it's very weird. And if you are on the boat, so to say, like, consider that, it's your interest as well to help me at least maintain the same rates of growth, right? The rest doesn't really matter. I'm really not complaining even about the fact that we're still 27,000. That's great, right? But let's grow faster. That's the thing that I'm interested in. Well, in any case, for today, I finally stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.